Hi, this is the Cat's Library. I'll be your librarian today. In this video, in the Animals from Reference series, I chose a mink. I was planning to do a mantis for the animal, but I felt like drawing something cute, and minks had stories while mantises did not. Engage, speed paint, oh wait, that already happened. I keep putting off redesigning my character sprites for Sprite, and redoing the channel banner, and also doing something else for my profile image because all of that sounds complicated and boring. I also need to find some sort of template for the new channel banner because it took multiple tries, both times I've done a banner, to get the name centered. Anyway, minks are related to weasels, ferrets, and otters, which is probably why my sister kept telling me that my drawing looked like an otter. They are semi-aquatic carnivores. They are famously heavily used in the fur trade, which in the modern day is more of a farming industry than a hunting one. Some mink have escaped from fur farms and become an invasive species outside of their natural habitat. There is also a problem of mink in farms getting something called stereotypy, or however that's pronounced, which essentially means that the minks go insane, and farms have to take precautions to keep that from happening, such as providing environmental enrichment and keeping the mink separated. Minks are solitary animals. They have territories which are several miles long on the banks of rivers or other inland bodies of water, but mostly live in the center of the territory. Male and female territories can overlap, but they don't tend to live together. Now, while all of this is super interesting, it's now time for me to explain the speed paint process. As of writing the script, this drawing took me 6 hours and 24 minutes. I tried having 2 references, but I could have used a few more so that I could visualize the form from different angles. I had one reference which was for copying and another to understand the skeletal structure. I also tried to find one of the muscular structure since I've been having difficulty with that in my drawings, mostly when it comes to humans, but I couldn't find it. In retrospect, I could have tried harder to find a diagram of an animal with a similar based anatomy, but as this turned out great, it doesn't really matter. I had 3.5 sketch layers. The half was because I liked the body of the first sketch, but the head still needed work. I was either having a bad sketch day and needed the extra time, or my standards increased and I kept going past what I usually do. I tried multiple different ways of drawing the fur throughout the process, and I stacked them on top of each other, which made a pretty cool effect. The animal in the photograph had wet fur, and I don't think that I've ever drawn wet fur before. I'm not really sure how well it turned out. The lighting wasn't really that complicated today, and the mink had a pretty uniform texture and color. The problem was that there was subtle variation between the colors and the texture, and I'm inexperienced with subtlety. I practiced my hard and soft shading layers with this drawing. For most of the process, there was too much soft blended shading, and the character blended into the background a bit too much. And so then I added a highlight layer that outlined the major fur tufts, which helped a lot. The background was fairly simple, but that still gives me a lot of trouble. I loosely used reference, and so it doesn't look as realistic as it could, but I can still tell that he's standing on a frozen riverbank with a snowy hill behind him. I've been working on keeping consistent color values, which was strangely difficult since this is pretty much monotone, as the colors are pretty muted. When I set it to grayscale, the image barely changed. I asked my mom for feedback, and she pointed out that the reference mink was much darker than I'd been coloring mine, and that did help with him standing out from the background. I realized midway through the process that I'd messed up the nose along the way. It was down way too low on his face, and it was too wide. On the reference, the nose itself was pretty narrow, and the muzzle widened as it got closer to the face. As I had several layers that I needed to modify if I wanted to change anything at that point, I decided to work around it and save fixing the face for the end of the process. Once I felt happy with everything else in the image, I made a new document that I set to one layer and futzed around with the liquefy tool to try to get the face to the correct configuration. It was at that point that I realized that I didn't really know how to use the liquefy tool. I kept changing the wrong parts of the face so that he looked weird, and when I finally got the proportions to look right, the head was too small. I copied the image because when I kept tweaking stuff, sometimes it would leave a blank spot, and having an image directly under it of the same fur and snow patterns was very helpful. At some point in the segment, I flipped the image and further applied liquefy because he had become quite lopsided after all of the abuse I'd put him through. I found some stories today. There was one that I found a couple places with different phrasing that is from this Native American tribe that I'm not going to try to pronounce. The other was allegedly recorded by Andrew Lang, and I don't know what tribe it is from. Andrew Lang recorded a bunch of fairy tales from around the world in the late 1800s, and he wrote the fairy books with the colors, like the blue fairy book and the pink fairy book and the orange fairy book and the mink. He didn't actually write that last one, I'm just getting back on topic. Okay, first story, The Mink and the Sun. A lady sea lion loved nothing more than to swim and to lie in the sun. One day, she found out that she was pregnant, and the only explanation that anyone in her family or community could come up with was that the sun himself was the father. I have no idea how that works, so that just the one sea lion gets pregnant, but whatever. What made slightly more sense, but was still pretty crazy, was that she gave birth to a mink. I suppose that didn't make sense to anyone else either, because the kids that the mink grew up with were relentless. Maybe because of this, and maybe because it wasn't just his nature, but the mink became a bit of a prankster, and a bit of a troublemaker, and mildly delinquent. He became a professional drifter for the mink equivalent of teenage years. One day, he looked up and decided that he wanted to take over for the sun because he thought that it looked easy. He waited for a hazy, rainy day and then climbed the tallest tree that he could find to end up in the sky world. He headed east until he found the sun's cabin and waited there with the sun's wife until his dad came home. It was a weirdly awkward reunion, but they were civil with each other and outwardly pretty happy. The sun even agreed to let Mink walk with him across the sky in the morning. He crossed his fingers behind his back and had a hushed conversation with his wife first, but he still agreed to let Mink walk with him. In the morning, the sun put on his fur cloak and his mask and picked up his torch, and he woke up Mink, and they took a nice walk. Sun said that one rule was that no matter how much the people on the ground begged for them to stop and melt away the rain, they had to keep going. It was a fairly nice day. The next day, Mink talked his way into wearing the shining robe and the mask, but Sun still held the torch. They walked past a thunderstorm. On the third day, Sun agreed to let Mink walk on his own in full regalia, but he secretly followed him. Mink got a fair distance along, but the pleas for him to stop really got annoying that day, and so eventually he stopped and let the torch hang low. The trees in the ground set on fire, and the people of Earth screamed at him to stop. Or, to keep going. Stop stopping and keep going. The sun ran up behind Mink and tackled him. In the process, the tar on the torch stained the mink's fur coat, causing it to become dark and stinky. The mink fell back to Earth, and the sun relit the torch and continued the journey home. That was the first eclipse. The mink survived and stayed on his own from then on. He didn't go out of his way to bother people and lived happily ever after. The next story is called The Mink and the Wolf. The mink was out fishing in his boat when a young wolf from a local prestigious family came up and started calling at the mink to bring the boat over. Mink tried to ignore him, but he was scaring away all the fish, and so Mink came over. "What?" "I want to come fishing with you." The wolf jumped in the boat and set his feet up. The mink rowed them out to the middle of the river and set out his line again. The mink offered the wolf some of his lunch, which were sea urchin eggs, and the wolf went to sleep after he was full from eating them all. Then the mink stabbed him to death and skinned him and put his pelt up for sale in his shop. Yeah, actually, the story is sort of dark. And then the wolf's grandmother came to the shop to buy sea urchin eggs, and that was how the mink was found out. Yeah, that's the darkest part of the story, and the mink doesn't get his comeuppance this time. I don't really want to finish retelling this one, but I'll leave the link to my source in the description if you want to know the rest. So that's the end of the video. Bye!